Hey, this is Jeff, and we need to talk about wealth tax. The policy strategists who every so often propose a wealth tax almost always do their best to disguise what the term actually means. Wealth tax and income tax are two entirely different things. Almost everyone understands income tax. When you receive income, your tips, your paycheck, your investment dividends, whatever, the government takes a cut. Wealth tax does not mean increasing income taxes for the wealthy. Wealth tax is flat out confiscation of assets that someone currently owns, assets which were already taxed previously as income. Now, it's easy to say, as long as you're taking stuff from rich people and not from me, why should I care? And that's a pragmatic, if selfish, response. You might even think if they're taking from the rich and giving to the poor, what's the problem? That's what Robin Hood did, right? Well, setting aside the fact that Robin Hood is a fictional character based on highly romanticized myths about real bandits who murdered and stole purely for their own benefit and may have thrown a few coins to the common folk so they wouldn't snitch, what is wrong with the fictional Robin Hood mentality? If the situation is that powerful people have stolen from you and the only option for justice is to steal your own stuff back, then in principle, I could get on board with that. But in the real world, successful Robin Hoods almost always end up becoming the new Sheriff of Nottingham, and they're usually even more brutal than the one they displaced. But back to wealth tax. As of 2021, there were around 600 billionaires in the US, and about half of them inherited their wealth. Of the half who are self-made, the degree to which they got to where they are by cheating and stealing is up for debate, but even if you assume that most of them got there more or less fairly, and I don't assume that, at the very least, most of them had what many people would consider a significant head start over the rest of us. Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, none of them were born billionaires, but they weren't poor growing up either. There are a handful of genuine rags to riches stories among the billionaires, like Oprah Winfrey and Jeff Bezos. And it does feel like it would be pretty unfair to just confiscate their fortunes and essentially punish them for their own success. But let's say we were willing to throw Oprah under the bus for the greater good because at least half of her peers didn't earn what they have. The combined net worth of America's billionaires is somewhere between $2.5 trillion and $4 trillion. The uncertainty is mainly because most of their fortunes are valued by the current stock price of the companies in their portfolios, and the average investor treats the stock market more like a casino than an investment platform. So those paper fortunes can fluctuate wildly from quarter to quarter, or even day to day. But we'll use the high-end estimate to make the best case we can for wealth tax. The federal budget for 2021 was $6.8 trillion. If we stole every penny from every billionaire in the country, we'd keep the lights on in the federal government for 7 months. And remember, wealth tax isn't income tax. Once you steal it and spend it, they have nothing left. Ultra-high net worth individuals have astronomical incomes, but that's from the return on the investments in their portfolios. When the portfolio is gone, so is the income. At the end of that 7 months, you can't go back to the well. It's dry. So saying that would pay for massively expensive new programs is either a failure to do basic arithmetic or it's a lie. So obviously, we need to steal everything from the rest of the 1%. Their combined net worth is a little harder to estimate, but excluding the billionaires, it's in the ballpark of $30 trillion. Depending on whose estimates you believe, that might be just about enough to pay for the Green New Deal or 10 years of universal health care, but probably not both. Or if you keep spending flat, you can run the country for 4.5 years. So sometime in the next 5 years, we'd need to start stealing from the rest of the top 10%. Excluding the 1% we already bankrupted, the next 9% is around $40 trillion, enough to pay for the other program or run the country another 6 years, assuming the federal budget stays flat. An unrealistic assumption, granted, considering the federal budget always grows, but I'm painting the best case picture for wealth tax here, so we'll assume it magically stops growing. Now, among that 9%, there are about 18 million millionaires in the US, and around 90% of them are self-made. Entrepreneurs, small business owners, specialized professionals, people like that. How many of them do you think are going to start over and bust their behinds to recreate that success, knowing the same thing will probably happen again? These are smart people. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. If I were in their place, I'd say, screw this. I'm just getting a job like everybody else. Except, bear in mind, the small businesses and doctors' offices and everything else they currently own provide jobs for more than half of the rest of us. There won't be any jobs for them to fall back on. Confiscate their assets, it's like saying, sorry, the American dream is canceled. But let's ignore the effect on the rest of the economy and assume that when we come back after that money's gone and we start stealing from the rest of the top 50%, their assets wouldn't have shrunk. Excluding the top 10%, that's another 40 trillion, give or take, enough to run the country for another 6 years. And when that runs out, it's time to grab everything that's left. If we ignore the fact that the bottom 50% won't have any jobs and will have been forced to spend what meager savings they had, that only amounted to about $2 trillion to begin with, enough to keep the federal government running less than 4 months. And at that point, less than 20 years after we started, quite possibly less than 10 if there were a couple of new big-ticket items in the budget. Or, if you remember, I used the most optimistic figures available to paint the best-case picture for wealth tax, and you decide to use the more realistic numbers, maybe only 5 years. At that point, there's no one left to steal from. Welcome to Venezuela. Okay, by now some of you are probably screaming at the screen that I've been talking about running the entire government with wealth tax, which is silly because it ignores the government's other sources of revenue. And you're right, that does stretch the timeline a bit. But it's trickier than you might think to calculate how much time that buys us because almost 90% of that other revenue comes from individual income taxes and payroll taxes. As you confiscate the assets of people whose income is generated by those assets, first the fortunes of the ultra-high net worth, and then the businesses of entrepreneurs and professionals, you reduce their taxable income to the same level as the people in the bottom 50%, who, like it or not, contribute very little to federal revenue. And at the same time revenue was falling, government spending would be increasing to provide people the basic goods and services that had been provided by all those doctors' offices and grocery stores and other businesses that the government seized from their previous owners. The real estate and capital equipment would still be there, but it would still need to be maintained, and one way or the other, either through entitlements or wages, they'd have to pay the people who work there, or else they'd sit idle and people would be starving in the streets. And sure, they could charge for those goods and services, but the government is never as efficient as the private sector at anything, so even then they'd be operating at a loss. There are so many variables that how long it would take is pure speculation, but it's absolutely inevitable that wealth tax would eventually decimate federal revenue from its primary source, income taxes and payroll taxes, making the problem they were trying to solve exponentially worse. Still screaming at the screen because all this is based on 100% wealth tax, which is ridiculous? I mean, we obviously can't take it all. We'll only take 5%. Okay, great, but that gets you enough money to run the government for less than a year at current spending levels if you steal from everyone, and only a few weeks if you limit it to the ultra-wealthy, and it doesn't even come close to paying for any expensive new programs. Other than a purely vindictive desire to hurt people because they have more than you, what's the point? I mean, that obviously is the point for some people, and fair enough, I guess. But have the guts to step up and be honest about it. Don't pretend it's about the budget. Well, I always like to wrap up with solutions and specific actions you can take, but I also like to keep these short, and I'm already running longer than usual. Abridged version, let your elected representatives know that wealth tax is a terrible idea, or if you insist on supporting it, then at least be honest about the reason why. Next time I'll talk more broadly about the federal budget and the national debt, the somewhat fictitious relationship between them, and what we can do about it, if anything. I know I just made that sound really boring, but trust me, it's almost Halloween, and this is scarier than any horror movie. It'll be fun! As always, thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe, and we'll talk again soon.